Paul Mason, hello, how are you?
I'm good, thanks.
Glad to hear it. So, I'd like to start with some context. You've been the economics editor of Newsnight, Channel 4 News. It's fair to say you have an understanding of the country's finances. Can you put some sense of scale on the position we're currently finding ourselves in?
Yeah, look, before COVID-19 hit, the Conservatives said, look, austerity is over. We know the NHS is a bit screwed. We're going to have to spend some money. And so they said, we'll probably need to borrow £60 billion, £60 billion this year. Once COVID-19 hit, they had to pay 9 million people's wages and hand out unlimited amounts of loans to big companies and small companies. So instead of 60, which they thought was a lot, they now think they're going to have to borrow £330 billion. Now, to give you a sense of scale of that, our total national debt accumulated since the Napoleonic War and the times of slavery is about 1.75 trillion. So we in a single year will do a third of a trillion. And we'll be lucky to get away with that. Now, I'm not a big worrier about debt, because I think that we can grow the economy. If we borrow and spend on stuff that helps the economy grow, that's a good thing. But the Tory ideology that debt is bad, that the big state is bad, that it crushes the private sector, well, it's saving the private sector. So we've both got a huge arithmetical number here and growing, and we've got an ideological problem. The Tory ideology no longer makes sense.
So, there's two things there. First of all, am I right in saying that there's never been a cheaper time, essentially, to borrow? And secondly, what sort of challenge does that present? You just touched on it there, the Tory ideology. That's confronting some fairly central tenets of their political philosophy, is it not?
It's absolutely natural that people say, well, how can we afford all this? And the people who've done these Tony degrees, the PPE degree at Oxford, they sit on the television and they ask the politicians, how are you going to afford it all? Well, the point is, how they've afforded it is that the central bank, the Bank of England or the Fed in America, can print money. And with that money, it buys the debt issued by the state. Now, at the moment, since 2008, the way they've done it is that the state sells the debt to the private sector, to pension funds, and then the Bank of England buys the debt off the pension funds. Ultimately, I'm an advocate of something called monetizing the debt, which means cut out the middleman. Central bank prints money, government borrows money, and central bank buys that piece of paper that says I owe you. It's not ideal, and it has downsides. It can lead to inflation. And of course, if the cost of borrowing rises, you're a bit screwed. But here's the beauty of this. The central bank, by buying the government's debt, can, to an extent, limit the cost of borrowing. So the big argument that's going to happen in British politics is twofold. One is, can we afford it? Should we go back to austerity? Now, the Tories know that the only people capable of paying taxes on a scale that will be able to pay this debt are rich people. So it's unlikely. And then the next big argument is, can we take this step, which Japan has done, which America has kind of done, is to stop pretending that the Bank of England and the government are separate. The two parts of the same thing, and use what we call, I know it's jargon, fiscal policy and monetary policy. So that's tax and spend on the one hand, and the central bank printing money on the other hand, in tandem, to drag this economy out of the deepest slump since 1921.
So I'm glad you went to 1921, because the government's plan for economic recovery, Johnson's called it a New Deal, Labour calls it a meal deal. Who's right?
Well, look, what the government's frightened of, and I am frightened of, is a second wave of the coronavirus. There's this big think tank in Paris called the OECD, very respectable. I believe what they generally say. They said, with one hit of the coronavirus, the British economy probably shrinks by 11% this year. With two hits, it's 14%. And you might think, well, we're screwed anyway. And I'm afraid that is the starting point. I think people I speak to in business say, while we're all rushing out, buying on the trainers we always wanted to buy over the last 6 months, they're saying, why are people doing that? Because we know, big business, we know we're going to be sacking a lot of people. Sunak's thing that he brought out, this
retention bonus.
Retention bonus. Thank you. It's really all it's doing is moving the cliff edge from October to January. But it's Sunak who's made the cliff edge. If they really wanted to sort this, they needed to do two things. The first is you've got to have you can't go on paying people's wages forever. People can't go on paying people not to work. Like in the 1930s, it was the left who said, instead of paying people not to work when you've got 22% of the population on benefits, why don't you spend money on creating work? In our modern context, it would be new theatres, new different kind of theatres, open air ones, or wind farm manufacture, or making. I've said use the Nightingale Hospital or build another one and then invite every graduate who can't get a job into it to sit there and work out how we should solve climate change and biodiversity, like having a massive innovation project. Okay, so that's one thing you've got to do. You've got to replace make work schemes with real investment. But the other thing is, this is another figure from the OECD. If we get a second wave of coronavirus, then in the 3 months to Christmas, this is the difference it makes. Without a second wave, we're going to be growing quite rapidly at 20% per annum. With the second wave, we'll be falling at 20% per annum. So if you imagine 3 months before Christmas, instead of a boom, which you usually get in retail, an absolute disaster. I don't think your generation, and you're not part of the Gen Z even, but I don't think young people have ever experienced the kind of employment we're going to experience anyway. But it could be a lot worse. So I'm a Labour supporting journalist. We're out of power. We're reliant on Sunak. And what we need to do is to convince them to do what the British government did in the 30s, which is to absolutely prioritise jobs and absolutely prioritise a different kind of economy that can deliver growth. And I'm afraid unless they do, then it's just good. Everybody's going on about how horrible and terrible these sweatshop factories are in Leicester. Those sweatshop factories are a result of a race to the bottom, powerlessness in the economy. And once you're out of a job, you're powerless. And when you can't just ring up Starbucks or Burger King or whatever and get the absolute entry level job because there are none, then people start thinking, well, what do I do? And the sweatshops arise and hyper exploitation arises when people haven't got any power in the marketplace. And I really hope that we can avoid that, but I'm not sure we're going to.
So you mentioned that there. It's a pretty striking contrast, the hopelessness, the fear of being in that situation. And it made me immediately think of sort of Sunak's PR campaign. Flashy coffee cups, handing out katsu curry and Wagamama. Regardless of the fiscal policy, he's looked good doing it, hasn't he?
Oh, look, people say, why is the Tories on 40%? If you give away money to people for free, that's quite a popular thing. And for real, what I think is happening is that they're preparing a PR strategy for when the economy goes south and if, let's hope not, but if the second wave of the coronavirus hits, because it's fairly clear to everybody that, without getting too technical, that the antibodies, that is the immunity that you could develop from having coronavirus, isn't really that strong, or it doesn't last, and not many people get it. So the range of outcomes of coronavirus are, it's like a very bad flu, like what people thought it could be, or it's more like HIV, and it's there for 35 years. Until a treatment emerges that people can live with it. So because we don't know that, the outcome of that, it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen. But Sunak is basically preparing the Tories for if the worst happens. I think what will happen if if the economy goes south and we get a second wave of coronavirus because we've gone back too soon, I'm told by senior business people that the Tories are telling them there won't be a second lockdown. So then the politics will be this: Labour, the opposition parties, probably a lot of older people my age will say, "Come on, we need a second lockdown." And then what I think the Tories are gambling is that young people have had enough of it. And even quite left-wing young people saying, well, what do I get out of this? And I think there'll come a moment in the autumn winter where a second lockdown becomes the political issue. The other thing is, it's quite obvious with this image building that Sunak is doing, is that if Johnson has to take the hit for this ridiculous failure to track and trace, failure on testing, failure on ventilators. And let's face it, he's not a well man. He's suffered personally, unfortunately, badly from the disease. If he has to be moved out of the way, then for the second time we'll have a new guy in, and then he'll go, yeah, but that was another government, which is what Johnson's been saying about Theresa May. But that was another government. So you were then in a perpetual Tory rule where you change the king. A revolution is the king replacing the king rather than the people replacing the king. That's where I think we're headed now in British politics.
There's a really interesting. People say the shift in the Overton window, but you're talking there about young people, traditionally Labour voters, these state interventions from the Tory party, and then I think to the Labour Party, and I wonder what its position is, because throughout this crisis so far, we've seen the sort of the official line has been, this is all right, but you could go further, regardless of the issue, and so. In terms of its electoral strategy and potential success in the future, what could the Labour Party do to try and either prevent the hemorrhaging of these voters towards the Tory party, or to go after a new part of the electorate?
Well, Labour's only route back to power is to win back largely unskilled, largely poor, largely small towns, largely elderly voters in those towns. Without you can have the whole of Bristol could vote Labour, and the whole of Brighton could vote Labour, but without those towns, there's no way back. So, and this is the source of this thing that people are frustrated about. Why are you so cautious? They're saying to Starmer. The reason is because when the MPs and ex-MPs who used to represent those towns listen to what people say, they want Labour to support the government as much as it can, because it is absolutely right that I'm somebody with a slightly raised risk if I get coronavirus. I need Boris Johnson to get this right. Keir Starmer can do nothing for me apart from the fact I support him, etc. Johnson and Sunak need to get it right. So that's where the bipartisanship arises from. This is not a political game, and it could, as I say, get a lot worse. But I think that Labour needs to prove its competence. The Tories have been incompetent. It needs to prove its professionalism, and I think that is what it's doing. But the crunch will come when the Tories have to spend not 330 billion in 1 year, but possibly the same amount 3 years running. When we've got a huge debt, the only people to tax are the rich. And at this point, so I think that what the outcome hopefully will be, I'm not so keen on the Overton window, but the consensus about politics and economics could shift in a very statist direction. And I think that will help Labour, because in order to do so, the Tories have to abandon what we call in economics the household finance analogy. The idea that the country can go bust and it can't afford stuff. No, if in my house here, so I've got a printer next to my desk, if that printer could print money, I could never go bust. But a government has that. That's the difference between the government and my house. So I hope once the Tories accept that, the argument becomes, what are we going to spend the money on? And here's where, for the young generation, I think Labour has an absolutely clear offer. And that is, let's spend it on saving this planet so that by the time you are, in middle age, it hasn't burned. Because, while we're obsessing with coronavirus, the Russian tundra is on fire. Australia's forests have been on fire. Bolsonaro is ripping down the Amazon. To put this right needs money. And it'll need jobs, new jobs. And it's a virtual It's a virtuous solution, isn't it? If we borrow the money and instead of just pouring it down the drain, spend it on greening this planet and reskilling people for jobs in a sort of 50-year process of saving our ecosystem, it's a win-win.
I'm now picturing the Mason household as some kind of shadowy Whitehall department. Paul Mason, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Our pleasure.